If you were alive in the 1990s, then you're likely a survivor of the 16-bit console war. This was a battle that spilled into the next generation when Sega not only had to go up against Nintendo, but also Sony and their PlayStation. Fast forward a few years and Microsoft would enter the fight, a rivalry that continues to this very day, with gamers arguing about which is better, the Xbox Series X, PlayStation 5, or Nintendo Switch. But while that conflict is somewhat interesting, Digital Eclipse wants to take you all the way back to the very first console war. That's the subject of the second, and possibly last, expansion pack to the wonderful Atari 50 compilation. It's a short yet informative trip back to a time when Atari went head-to-head with Mattel for video game supremacy. Adding 19 games to the package and offering a bunch of new interviews, is this a fitting conclusion to Atari's story? That's what we're about to find out when I review Atari 50, the first console war. Having already covered the rise, fall, and resurrection of Atari, Digital Eclipse is back with the first console war, the second of two paid expansion packs for Atari 50. As the name suggests, this chapter of the story goes into the rivalry between Atari's VCS console and Mattel's competing Intellivision. Released 2 full years after the VCS, the Intellivision was sold as a more advanced console that was capable of displaying far superior graphics. Of course, that visual fidelity came at a price, making the Intellivision about $100 more expensive than the competition. But don't worry, Mattel had an ace up their sleeve. Night after night, sports writer George Plimpton would show the TV-watching audience that the Intellivision baseball game looked just like the real thing, while Atari was just a bunch of blocks on screen. And with that, the battle was on. This DLC dives into the history through both archival footage and interviews with the people who worked at Mattel during that short but exciting part of gaming history. We see the strategizing on both sides, along with the view from the third parties that were supporting both second-generation consoles. We get an especially funny story about how the two systems fought through television commercials. And best of all, we dig into the game design philosophy over at Mattel and how the two sides would fraternize with each other, mostly against their boss's wishes. There's a lot of insight into both companies' histories, and it helps to add a lot of context to the Atari 50 story. Now, there comes a point in the history lesson when Mattel, who could never quite outsell the popular VCS, decides to start releasing games on the competing system. And that's when this expansion pack switches from the story to the actual games. Of the 19 games added to the roster, 12 of them come from M Network, the name that Mattel would use to publish games on the Atari VCS. That's really the big draw of this package. The good news is that these M Network games are actually a lot of fun. Seeing as most of them were released later in the 2600's lifespan, the games in this expansion are a bit more ambitious and better looking than a lot of the VCS titles that we're used to. A great example of that is Frogs and Flies, a port of the Intellivision game Frog Bog. This is a surprisingly addictive two-player competition to see which frog can gobble up the most flies by jumping between lily pads. The game looks great and even has a day-night cycle. Another good one is Star Strike, which was clearly inspired by the trench run in Star Wars. I was also impressed with Astro Blast, which is like Space Invaders but on speed. Once I was able to settle into the game's urgency, I was hooked. Astro Blast is a real highlight of the package. Now, much like the last expansion, this DLC comes with a number of rare, unreleased, and prototype games. One of the best is Antbear, a fun mix between Pac-Man and Frogger, where you use your tongue to tunnel underground for delicious food. It's an odd shake-up of the maze game formula, but it works, and actually probably would have been a big hit. Final Legacy, on the other hand, shows off just how ambitious the developers were getting by the mid-1980s. It's a strategy game that had you taking out targets, either using your land to see artillery or by sending torpedoes to attack the different ships. The different attack styles had their own unique look and gameplay, adding a real sense of variety. There's also Tower of Mystery, an unreleased prototype that was only recently rescued. While I didn't find it to be all that much fun, it was great to see the developer rediscover it after 4 decades. One thing that surprised me was how big of a role sports played in this expansion. Not only do we get the Super Challenge baseball and football games that George Plimpton told us about between episodes of BJ and the Bear, but it also comes with international soccer and sword fight, which is pretty much exactly what it sounds like. However, the real sports star here is HardBall, the 1985 version of the long-running baseball game that kept putting out sequels well into the 1990s. I can't stress this enough, but HardBall looks fantastic, and it's actually extremely easy to play. It's an early baseball game that absolutely nails what's great about the sport, all while creating a pitcher-batter dynamic that's both strategic and fun. And did I mention that it looks amazing? This thing came out the same year that Nintendo brought their baseball game to the States, and the difference is night and day. This is easily one of the best games in this entire package, and I'm not even that big of a baseball fan. And let me tell you, the good games don't stop there. I was excited to see the Atari 7800 version of Desert Falcon, one of the best games to come out of the last expansion pack. This 1987 version is easier to play and just looks substantially better. Another favorite was Dark Cavern, a 1982 maze game with a shoot-'em-up twist. It's actually the perfect mix between Pac-Man and Berserk, and the action is both fast-paced and addictive. I got into it a lot more than I expected, which is actually true of a lot of the games found in this expansion. Between the M-Network games and HardBall, this DLC makes a strong case for why it should exist. Now, while this expansion pack is mostly about Mattel and Intellivision, it's important to realize that this is still an Atari compilation. That's something that I had to keep reminding myself, because there's just so much talk about the Intellivision that it makes you actually want to play those games. I mean, we already have a bunch of Atari 2600 games in the collection, so let's see if George Plimpton was right and the graphics really are that much better. Sadly, we're never really given a chance to compare the two. Despite Atari buying up the brand and library earlier this year, there's no Intellivision emulation here. I don't know, perhaps that'll come with an entirely different compilation. Either way, it's a missed opportunity. Another thing I want to mention are the interviews. Because this expansion pack was released just a few days before Tetris Forever, I found myself jumping between the 2 digital Eclipse compilations quite a bit. One thing that I couldn't help but notice was how much I preferred the look of the interviews in the Tetris game. Here, most of the interviews are conducted in front of a green screen, so when we see him in the game, it looks like everyone's floating in a fancy screensaver from the 1990s. Compare that to the footage of Hank Rogers and Alexei Pajitnov, who ditched the green screen in favor of a more natural background, an office or a window with a nice view of the city. I hate to say it, but I found it a little hard to go back to the chroma keyed look of Atari 50. I don't know if it's because they couldn't find a good-looking location to film, or perhaps it's just an attempt at uniformity, but I found myself wishing the interviews were conducted in front of pretty much anything but a green screen. I suppose I could once again complain about the lack of additional Lynx and Jaguar games. But look, that's clearly not where the emphasis is on this package. After a full compilation and 3 expansions, it's obvious that Atari would rather reminisce about the good old days, which in this case means going back to the time when VCS was kicking the Intellivision's butt. This DLC tells an interesting story and comes with a bunch of fun games. It's not the best part of Atari 50, but it definitely makes the package that much better. And when push comes to shove, isn't that what good DLC is supposed to do? Now that we've looked at the wider world of Atari, Digital Eclipse returns with an Atari 50 expansion pack that chronicles the very first console war. Through interviews, archival footage, and a bunch of games, we see the VCS battle Mattel's Intellivision, a more powerful piece of hardware from a fierce competitor. While not as flashy as the main game, this expansion offers a surprisingly great selection of games. including real standouts like HardBall, Antbear, Dark Cavern, and Frogs and Flies. While I have a few small issues with the presentation and the lack of additional Lynx and Jaguar games, none of this should overshadow what could very well be the final chapter in one of the greatest video game compilations of all time. Hey, thanks for watching my review. If you liked what you saw here, then you should know that we post new reviews and features almost every day. In fact, we just posted a Tetris Forever review on Monday. So if you're into these types of history lesson compilations, definitely check that one out. Now, here's the question I have for you. What's your favorite console war? Look, I'm someone who would make a forceful argument for the 16-bit battle. But hey, maybe you're different. Maybe you think that the 32-bit war was more eventful, or possibly something even more recent. Let me see your picks in the comments below. In other news, we'll be back later this week with a Review Crew episode. With Tetris Forever coming out this week, I just have to imagine that we're going to see a Nintendo Switch Online update featuring the NES version of Tetris. While you wait for that, I strongly recommend you click that subscribe button and support what we're doing here. Until then,